The old American frontier had a silence that carried its own kind of warning, the kind that made travelers slow their steps and listen to the wind before they moved again. People said the land remembered everything, every trail of hoofprints and every night fire, every deal made between strangers. On nights when the mountains glowed with the last lines of sunlight, the stories came alive in the air, drifting across the plains like distant drums calling someone toward a fate they did not yet understand. That was the same evening. A weary rider appeared along the narrow path running between the cottonwoods and the red cliffs. He looked as if the miles behind him held more trouble than the miles ahead. Dust covered his boots and the edges of his coat. His horse's sides rose and fell heavily, as though it had crossed half the world just to bring him to this quiet pocket of the frontier. The rider had not meant to wander so close to Apache lands, but storms, stolen supplies, and a broken rifle had pushed him deeper into the wilderness than he ever planned. He had heard the stories, of course. Travelers in the nearest settlement spoke of the tribe with a mix of respect and fear. They said the Apache guarded their land with fierce loyalty, yet treated honest guests with surprising hospitality. People repeated old sayings about customs and traditions that no outsider could fully understand. Some claimed guests were tested, that the tribe wanted to see what kind of heart a stranger carried. Others warned that the guest had duties to fulfill before being allowed to leave. Most of it was rumor, passed from one porch to another, but on the frontier even rumors carried enough truth to shape a man's choices. Still, the rider pushed onward because he had no other path left. Hunger had hollowed his stomach. A sharp pain in his shoulder reminded him of the fall he took while crossing a ridge 2 days earlier. The night wind felt colder now, sharp enough that he knew he would not last long without shelter. The dim light of a fire in the valley below caught his eye. It flickered, warm and steady, rising between the shadows of the pines. He hesitated, holding his reins tightly. Every instinct told him he was stepping into a world that followed rules different from his own. Yet the promise of warmth and help was stronger than the fear curling in his chest. With a careful breath, he nudged his horse toward the light dot as he approached. He saw figures gathered around the fire. Women, dressed in traditional clothes with beads catching the firelight, were preparing food and tending to woven baskets. Their voices rose softly in a language he didn't understand, but their tone carried a sense of peace. A few children peeked out from behind one of the shelters, wide-eyed and curious about the stranger. The smell of roasted corn drifted toward him, mixing with the scent of smoke and earth. For a moment, the rider felt he had stepped out of his troubles and into another world entirely. Before he could speak, one of the women lifted her hand, signaling him to stop. She studied him carefully, not with fear, but with a wisdom that made him lower his gaze out of respect. An older woman stepped forward, her silver-streaked hair tied with a thin strip of leather. Lines on her face hinted at decades of watching the land and the people grow and change. She spoke to him with calm strength, and though he didn't know the words, her gesture toward the fire made her meaning clear. He dismounted slowly, showing he meant no harm. His legs trembled from exhaustion, and when he stepped closer to the fire, he felt warmth spreading through him for the first time in days. The women murmured among themselves, observing him. One handed him a small clay cup filled with warm broth. He accepted it with both hands, grateful enough that his eyes softened, but relief faded when the older woman spoke again. Her words translated by a younger woman who knew some English. Her voice was steady as she explained a tradition older than any settlement on the frontier. The Apache believed that a guest was not just someone passing through. A true guest carried responsibility. They were expected to bring good energy, respect, and helpfulness to the camp. The women, especially, judged whether a guest honored the ways of the tribe. Their approval determined the guest's fate, whether he could stay, whether he earned protection, and whether the men of the tribe would welcome him as a friend, or treat him with caution. The young woman told him the custom clearly. Women held the role of evaluating the stranger's character. A guest had to show kindness, humility, and willingness to help. He had to ease burdens, repair what he could, and offer a pleasant spirit that brought comfort rather than trouble. If he could delight the women by proving he brought goodness instead of harm, he would be accepted. If not, the tribe would ask him to leave before sunrise. The rider felt his pulse climb. He had arrived seeking nothing more than shelter, yet now he stood at the edge of a tradition that could decide whether he walked away safely or faced the darkness again alone. The women watched him intently, waiting for his reaction. Their eyes held curiosity but also a firm expectation that he would honor the custom of the land he had entered. He nodded slowly, aware he had no other choice. The younger woman smiled faintly, as if his simple acceptance was the first small step in the right direction. But the older woman remained unreadable, her expression giving nothing away. The women circled him gently, assessing him. They commented on his worn clothes, his injuries, his tired horse. They asked him small questions through the translator, wanting to understand the kind of man he was, where his journey had begun, and what troubles had chased him across the plains. He answered honestly, even when the truth felt raw. The women listened carefully, examining every tone, every detail. Their silence afterward was harder to endure than their questions. As the night deepened, more tribe members arrived. Some brought food, others carried woven blankets or small carved items. Their presence made the camp lively, but the rider felt the weight of every gaze. The murmurs and soft conversation felt like judgment he couldn't escape. The men of the tribe stood a short distance away, watching him with calm but unignorable intensity. They waited to see whether the women would approve of him, and the rider felt a pressure he had never known before. He tried to help where he could. One of the baskets had a broken edge, and he quietly repaired it with careful hands. A child dropped a bundle of sticks, and he picked them up without being asked. He offered his horse to be examined by one of the men who seemed to understand animals better than anyone he had met. The women noticed everything. Some exchanged thoughtful glances, others whispered, weighing every small act, yet something told him his efforts were not enough. The older woman remained silent, watching him with eyes that seemed to read parts of him he had never shared with anyone. When she finally rose from her seat and stepped toward him, the entire camp quieted. She touched the worn fabric of his coat, then pointed toward a distant ridge where shadows moved beneath the moonlight. Her expression carried meaning he did not yet understand, but the younger woman translated with a tremor in her voice. The tribe had one more test, a final measure of whether he could be trusted. Something had happened earlier that day near the ridge, something the tribe needed help with. Something only a guest willing to prove his spirit could face, before he could ask what danger waited beyond the firelight. The older woman gave a single nod that felt both like permission and a warning. The entire camp watched him, waiting to see whether he would choose courage or turn away. The rider felt his breath catch as he looked toward the dark ridge, realizing his fate depended on a challenge he had not yet seen, and the night around him grew still, as if the land itself was holding its breath. Waiting for his answer, the rider stared toward the ridge, feeling the night press against his skin like something alive. He could sense eyes on him, dozens of quiet breaths waiting for him to choose a direction. The older woman had not explained the nature of the task, but the weight of her gaze told him it was not something small. The younger woman who translated looked uneasy too, as if she already knew the danger that lived out there. The fire crackled softly behind him, giving the illusion of safety. Yet the path ahead felt colder than the wind itself. He wished he had more strength, but the truth was written in the aches of his body. Days of hunger, cold, and fear had worn him thin. Still, something inside him pushed against the idea of turning back. Maybe it was pride. Maybe it was the simple knowledge that he had nowhere else to go. Or maybe it was the understanding that these people, who owed him nothing, had still offered warmth and food. If the custom of the tribe asked him to prove himself, then he would try. As he stepped away from the fire, he could hear the women whispering behind him. Some voices carried worry, others curiosity. The men remained distant but alert, their eyes following him like hunters watching a lone figure enter the unknown. The younger woman approached him with a small lantern made from stretched hide. She held it out with both hands, her voice low as she told him the ridge was less than half an hour's walk if he followed the narrow trail. Her tone softened when she warned him to stay close to the path and not wander toward the deeper woods. He asked what he was supposed to find, but she shook her head. The test was about heart and intention, she said. The tribe believed a guest should show understanding without needing every detail spelled out. The land would reveal what needed to be done. Her words gave him more questions than answers, but there was no time to ask them. The night wrapped around him as he walked. The lantern's soft glow brushing against the trunks of pines and the red dirt beneath his boots. The silence of the old American frontier was different here. It felt more watchful, more aware. Each gust of wind carried faint scents of sage and smoke. Somewhere in the distance an owl called out, its voice long and lonely. He gripped the lantern tighter, trying to steady his breath as the shadows shifted in front of him. He thought about everything that had brought him to this moment. He had not always lived on the edge of survival. There had been a time when he knew the warmth of a familiar home and the steady comfort of his own land. But the frontier could change a man's life overnight. A failed harvest, a brutal storm, a dispute with people more powerful than he was, all of it had swept away the life he once knew. Wandering became his only path, and trouble followed him more often than luck. Yet as he walked through the dark, he realized how little he understood about the Apache way of life. This tribe lived with rules older than any settlement he had visited. Their customs were shaped by the land, by their ancestors, and by the spirits they believed watched over them. Travelers spoke of their strength, their loyalty, and their respect for people who approached them with honesty. But they also spoke of ancient expectations, like the belief that a guest must carry goodness in his heart. The women, especially, commanded the tribe's trust. They saw what men often overlooked. They chose who belonged and who didn't. The writer wondered what they saw in him. A tired stranger? A broken man? A passing shadow who would vanish by morning? Or someone who might still carry a piece of hope, despite everything he had lost? The trail narrowed as he climbed closer to the ridge. Rocks jutted out from the ground and the air grew colder. The moon shone weakly behind clouds, giving just enough light for him to see the outline of fallen branches and shrubs. His lantern flickered whenever the wind brushed against it. He stepped carefully, knowing one wrong move could send him sliding down the steep slope beside him. Then he heard it. A faint, sharp sound that did not belong to the night. He froze, listening again. It came once more, soft but strained, like a small cry or a pained breath. His pulse quickened as he turned the lantern toward the sound. It was coming from somewhere near a cluster of rocks closer to the ridge. He moved cautiously, raising the lantern higher. The light touched something small on the ground, something trembling. At first he thought it was an animal, but as he got closer he saw the shape of a child curled beside the rocks. The child flinched when the light reached them, covering their face with both hands. The writer's heart lurched. A child alone in the dark was the last thing he expected to find. He knelt slowly, making sure not to scare them. The child peeked through their fingers, fear shining in their eyes. Their clothes were torn and dusty. One leg seemed twisted awkwardly, as if they had fallen and could not stand. He set the lantern down gently, keeping his hands visible. He spoke softly, telling the child he meant no harm. Though the child did not understand English, the calm in his voice eased some of their fear. They lowered their hands slightly, revealing a face streaked with dirt and tears. The writer's breath tightened. This child belonged to the tribe. If he failed to help them, he would fail the test and lose whatever fragile trust he had earned. He examined the injured leg carefully. The child winced but did not resist. The injury looked painful but not beyond repair. He tore a strip from his shirt and wrapped the leg to keep it steady. When he tried to lift the child, they clung to his coat, trembling hard enough that he felt it through his arms. The walk back to camp became heavier with every step. The trail felt twice as long, and the darkness pressed closer. The writer kept whispering calm words, even though he knew the child could not understand them. His voice was not for understanding. It was for comfort. The lantern swayed with each movement, casting shadows that looked like moving figures in the trees. When the glow of the campfire finally appeared through the trees, he felt a wave of relief. The child stirred in his arms, recognizing the light and the distant voices. As they stepped into the open, the entire camp froze. Women gasped. Men rushed forward. The older woman rose quickly, her eyes sharp with shock and relief. The rider set the child down gently, and the tribe surrounded them instantly. The younger woman checked the injured leg and murmured something to the older woman. The older woman touched the child's cheek, her expression softening. Then she looked at the rider with new eyes. Not warmer, not colder, but deeper, as though she saw something different now. The tribe carried the child away to tend to the injury. The camp murmured with emotion and questions. Some looked at the rider with gratitude, others with surprise. But none looked away. He stood in the center of the fire's glow, breathing hard from the weight of the journey and the pressure of everything he had just faced. The younger woman approached him after a long moment. Her voice held both calm and something like awe. She told him the child had wandered off earlier that day while chasing a stray dog. The tribe had searched until dusk but had not found them. They feared the child had been taken by the darkness of the ridge. She explained quietly that the older woman was the child's grandmother and one of the most respected figures in the tribe. Her approval mattered more than anyone else's. No guest had ever returned with something so important. The rider listened, unsure how to react. Part of him felt relief, but another part sensed that this was only the beginning. The custom had not ended. Helping the child had earned him trust, but the tribe was still cautious. He was still a stranger. And the frontier rarely allowed easy answers. The younger woman glanced toward the men gathering near the edge of camp. They spoke low, their faces serious. She said the tribe had other worries tonight, dangers far beyond an injured child or a lost guest. Before he could ask what she meant, the older woman called his name. Her voice carried authority that stilled the camp instantly. She did not smile, but she stepped closer. Studying him again as if weighing whether he was ready to hear what came next, she pointed toward the woods, the same direction the child had wandered from. Her eyes darkened with warning. Something else had been near the ridge. Something that did not belong to the tribe. Something that had left tracks the men were now examining in silence. The rider felt the tension thicken around him. Whatever waited beyond the trees had not come for the child. It had come for something else, and the tribe was deciding whether he would be part of stopping it or become another burden the land would swallow. The older woman did not speak right away. She stood in the thin line between firelight and shadow, watching the rider with the quiet care of someone who had seen many winters and many kinds of men. The camp had settled into a tense hush. Children were kept close to their mothers. The men by the edge of the trees stood with their shoulders tight, as if waiting for a signal no one else could see. At last, she raised her hand and called a few words toward the men near the woods. One of them stepped forward, tall and broad, with a bow across his back and a calm, sharp gaze. He came to stand across from the rider, studying him in a way that did not feel hostile, yet did not feel friendly either. This man carried the weight of someone who protected more than himself. The younger woman whispered that he was one of the main hunters and scouts of the tribe, trusted to guard their people when danger pressed close. The older woman spoke to him first, her tone low and steady. The hunter listened, then nodded once and shifted his attention fully to the rider. Through the translator he explained what they had found near the ridge. Tracks, he said, that did not belong to any animal they knew. Boot prints, wagon wheels, and the marks of something dragged. Smoke from a fire that did not belong to their camp. The hunter had followed the signs only for a short time before returning, not wanting to lead any threat closer to the children. The rider felt a cold chill run through him that had nothing to do with the wind. He knew the pattern too well. Outsiders, men who moved where they wished and took what they wanted. The frontier was scattered with such groups, drifting between settlements and lonely farms. Some were desperate. Others were simply cruel. When they crossed near Apache land, trouble often followed. The hunter said the tracks were fresh, left not long before the sun went down. The older woman turned to the rider again. Through the young woman, she asked a question that cut straight into him. Had he seen such men on his journey? Had he traveled near any wagons that did not belong to peaceful traders? Her eyes searched his face as if she could read the truth in the lines around his mouth. He swallowed, then admitted he had seen a small group of men in a wagon 2 days earlier, further west. They had camped near a stream, loud and careless, joking about gold, land, and how no one could stop them if they wanted to claim something. He had chosen to ride past them, keeping his distance. Their laughter had carried a sharpness he did not like. Now, hearing about the tracks near the ridge, he wondered if they had followed him, or if they were moving on their own path that just happened to cross this land. Either way, their presence here meant danger. For him and for the tribe that had taken him in as a guest, the hunter seemed to sense his unease. He stepped closer, speaking slowly so the younger woman could keep up with the translation. The tribe believed that the land watched how people behaved, that it remembered kindness and cruelty alike. When trouble came, the land brought forward those who needed to face it. The hunter said the rider might not have led these men here, but his path had crossed theirs. In the eyes of the tribe, that meant he was now tied to whatever was coming. The rider wanted to argue that he had nothing to do with those men. He wanted to say he was just as much a victim of the harsh frontier as anyone else. But he could feel the tired ache in his soul and knew it would sound like an excuse. Guests in this tribe were not allowed to stand aside when danger threatened the women and children who had shared their fire. The custom that asked him to delight the women, to earn their trust through help and respect, reached deeper than simple chores or gentle words. It meant standing with them when fear moved near. As the night wore on, the camp began to move with quiet purpose. Women gathered supplies, wrapped younger children in blankets, and checked on the injured child resting in a shelter near the center of the camp. The older woman visited the child, murmuring softly in their language, then stepped back into the open once more. The rider noticed how the women did not panic. They moved with practiced grace as if they had faced threats before and knew that fear wasted valuable time. The younger woman stayed near the rider, as if she had been given the task of watching him and guiding him. She explained that the tribe had faced raiders in the past, both white and native, men driven by greed, anger, or hunger. They did not like war, but they would not run from it either. They hoped always to stop trouble before it became blood. That was why they needed to know what kind of man he was. A guest with bad intent could cause more damage from inside the camp than any enemy outside it. He listened, feeling a weight grow in his chest that was heavier than any pack he had ever carried. He realized something he had not wanted to admit. He had come to this land thinking of himself as a man with nothing left to lose. His farm was gone. His savings had vanished into debts. His past felt like a distant fire that had burned itself out. But here, among people who measured worth by actions rather than wealth, he found himself wanting to be seen as more than a broken wanderer. He watched the women moving about the fire, handing out food, soothing frightened children, straightening blankets. Even now, with danger close, they still looked at him, judging quietly. Not with harshness, but with the expectation that he would rise or fall by his own choices. If he helped, if he brought calm and strength, he would delight them in the way their custom demanded. If he failed, he would confirm every fear that strangers only brought trouble. A subplot began to take shape in the camp itself. The hunter did not fully trust him. The younger woman seemed torn between doubt and hope. The older woman guarded some secret pain that shadowed her gaze whenever she looked at the injured child. And among the women there were different opinions. One, with sharp eyes and a firm jaw, kept her distance from him, whispering to the others that no good ever came from letting a stranger too close. Another, younger and softer, argued that anyone who carried a child to safety in the dark could not be entirely bad. The rider felt each of those opinions, like small weights on a scale that had not yet tipped in his favor. He tried to keep his hands steady as he helped gather firewood and carry water from the nearby stream. The older woman watched him every time he bent down to lift a basket or offered kind words to the frightened children. The younger woman translated only when needed now. She seemed to be measuring how much he understood without words. Later that night, as the fire burned lower, the hunter returned from the edge of camp with news. He had followed the tracks again for a short distance, enough to confirm his fears. There were at least 4 men, maybe more, and a wagon. They had set a small camp not far beyond the trees. From the way they moved, he guessed they were planning to stay until morning, scouting the area for something. Perhaps they had already seen the smoke from the Apache camp. Perhaps they were curious. Or perhaps they were searching for something specific, like a hidden trail, water, or a place where the land opened wide enough for a new claim. The writer's mind went back to the talk he had heard near the stream 2 days before. Those men had spoken loudly, careless with their words. They had bragged of land that belonged to no one, of pushing people aside if they got in the way. Now he realized that when they said no one, they had meant no one they cared to recognize. Not the tribes who had lived here generations before. Not the travelers who moved through the land with respect. Men like that measured worth only by power. The hunter looked at the rider with a frank, steady gaze. He said the tribe would watch through the night. At dawn, decisions had to be made. Would they move the camp deeper into the hills? Would they confront the men and make it clear the land was not empty? Would they send someone to observe more closely? The older woman's eyes turned toward the rider again in that same searching way. Without saying it directly, they all made it clear the guest would not be allowed to stand on the edge and do nothing. The younger woman led him to a quieter place near one of the shelters where he could rest for a few hours. The sky overhead had grown darker, and the stars had come out sharp and bright. She sat on a log while he lowered himself onto the ground, his body grateful for even a small break. For a moment, the tension of the camp softened. She asked him, gently, what he had lost out there on the frontier. Nobody came this far unless they were running from something or searching for something. He hesitated, then told her about the farm, the failed crops, the storm that tore through his fields and left him with nothing but debts. He told her how a powerful man in a nearby town had taken advantage of his weakness, offering a loan with terms he barely understood until it was too late. When he could not pay, men came to his land, forced him out, and claimed his home as theirs. He had left with only his horse, his coat, and the few supplies he could carry. That was the beginning of his wandering. That was how he had learned that the frontier was not just a place of opportunity, but a place where the strong often stepped on the weak. She listened quietly, her eyes thoughtful. When he finished, she said the tribe knew what it meant to lose land. For them, it was not a memory from one man's life, but a story told across generations. Settlers moved in, roads cut through old hunting grounds, and soldiers drew lines on maps that ignored the paths their ancestors once walked. The tribe had survived by holding on to the places they could and guarding them with everything they had left. This valley, this camp, the ridge nearby, they were not just pieces of ground. They were memories, stories, and the last safe home for their children. Hearing this, the rider felt his loss and theirs twist together inside him like 2 strands of the same rope. He realized the approaching men with the wagon posed a deeper threat than a simple raid. If they liked what they saw here, they might return with more people, with papers, with weapons, with claims backed by those who never set foot on the land they seized. The tribe's way of life, their custom of honoring guests and trusting the women to judge character, could be swept aside by strangers who saw no value in such things. The night deepened, and the fire burned low, but sleep did not come easily. The rider lay awake, listening to the soft crackle of embers and the distant movements at the edge of camp. Somewhere in the dark, the hunter watched the trees for any sign of change. The older woman remained close to the injured child, resting but never fully relaxing. The younger woman sat near the fire, glancing toward the path that led to the ridge, as if expecting trouble to step out of the shadows at any moment. The rider felt the pull of the conflict tighten around him. He was caught between his past and his present, between the world of the settlers and the world of this Apache tribe that had shown him unexpected kindness. Dawn would bring a choice. He could claim he was only a guest and try to slip away before things grew worse. Or he could stand with the people who had given him broth, warmth, and a chance to prove he was more than the hardest parts of his story. The stars turned slowly overhead. The sounds of the night shifted. A faint echo drifted through the trees, distant yet clear enough to make his heart beat faster. A muffled laugh. The crack of a stick. The faint clink of metal. Somewhere out there, the men with the wagon were awake too, planning whatever move they would make when the first gray light touched the sky, and with every passing moment, the land seemed to tighten its grip around the camp, holding everyone inside a ring of waiting, as if the earth itself knew that the real test for the guest and for the tribe had not yet begun. The soft glow of dawn had not yet touched the sky when the rider opened his eyes. He did not remember falling asleep, yet the stiffness in his muscles told him he had drifted off for a short, uneasy rest. The air felt heavier now, as if the land itself sensed trouble drawing closer. The fire was little more than faint orange coals. The camp was quiet, but not asleep. People moved slowly, placed in small groups, whispering and preparing without panic. A few women ground corn. Some men checked their boughs. Children were kept inside shelters, their small faces peeking out nervously. The hunter stepped out of the shadows moments later, his presence calm but alert. He walked straight to the rider and crouched beside him. The younger woman followed, rubbing sleep from her eyes. She had stayed up longer than anyone else, watching him as though she feared he might slip away in the night. Now she stood close, ready to translate every word that mattered. The hunter spoke in low tones. He said that danger was no longer an idea or a distant worry. The men near the ridge were awake. Smoke from their campfire drifted through the trees when he circled the woods just before dawn. One voice had carried louder than the rest, talking about land, water, and how they could make use of what they found. The hunter believed they knew a tribe was nearby. Whether they planned to approach with peace or with force was unclear. But the tribe could not assume kindness from strangers who hid in the dark. Instead of presenting themselves openly, the rider felt a tightness in his stomach. He remembered the careless, greedy laughter from the night he passed them by the stream. Those men did not speak like people searching for peace. They sounded like men hungry for ownership, not friendship. He rubbed his hands together, trying to warm the cold rising under his skin. The older woman approached then, her step steady and her jaw firm. She carried a small bag of herbs and a strip of leather tied with beads. She handed the leather to the rider. The younger woman translated that it was a token, a symbol of trust. Not full trust, but the beginning of it. The rider was still a guest, but he had shown more good heart than many outsiders. The token meant he would be allowed to stand with the tribe during what was coming. It meant the women believed he carried no harm. The rider bowed his head respectfully, feeling the warmth of something like gratitude tug inside his chest. But the older woman's eyes were not soft. She made it clear through her voice and gestures that trust was not complete. He still had to prove himself when the moment came. The hunter motioned for him to follow. The young woman joined them, and the three of them walked toward a higher part of the camp, where the land rose enough to peek over the trees. From this point, the forest spread out in a sea of green and brown. Far beyond the thick branches, faint streaks of gray smoke curled into the sky. The rider swallowed. The threat felt closer now, more real than it had when the night hid everything. The hunter explained that the tribe wanted to avoid bloodshed. But if those men pushed forward claiming land or trying to frighten the camp, the tribe needed someone who knew their ways. Someone who could speak in the settlers' tongue. Someone who might convince them to leave before harm was done. The younger woman added quietly that the tribe's peace depended on balance. A single reckless step from either side could break that balance. The rider reminded them he had no weapon except a small knife. The hunter nodded, saying weapons were not the measure of a man's strength. The land judged heart before force. The tribe valued calm minds more than sharp steel. Still, he held out a bow toward the rider. Not as a weapon to start conflict, but a tool for protection if things turned dark. The rider took it, feeling its weight settle into his hands like a silent promise. As the sun began to rise, painting the sky with a pale silver, the camp shifted into a more tense rhythm. The women tended to the injured child, checking the bandage and whispering comforting words. The older woman brushed the child's hair gently, her eyes holding a mixture of relief and worry. The child clung to her arm, sensing the fear spreading quietly through the adults nearby. The stern woman who had doubted the rider from the start watched him with narrowed eyes. She spoke to the others, her voice carrying caution. The younger, hopeful woman argued softly, insisting he had already helped save the child. The camp's trust hung in a delicate balance. Just like the peace the tribe hoped to keep, the rider tried to ignore their debate, focusing instead on the path the hunter wanted to take. The plan was simple but dangerous. They would approach the ridge from the east, circle the woods quietly, and observe the wagon group from a distance. They needed to understand what those men intended before the tribe could decide how to respond. The older woman spoke a few words, and her voice made the men and women straighten with respect. The younger woman translated that the land remembered bravery and it also remembered fear. If a guest wished to remain among them, he needed to walk with courage now. The rider nodded, accepting the weight of her expectation when the hunter started moving. The rider followed automatically. The younger woman trailed close behind, carrying a small satchel of herbs and protective charms. She said the charms were for strength and for clarity. She said the land listened to truth when people walked with clean intentions. The trail down the ridge was narrow and uneven. Dry branches cracked under their steps. Birds scattered from the trees, startled by their presence. The deeper they went, the thicker the shadows became. The sun had risen fully by now, but the tall pines blocked most of the light, turning the air into soft, shifting darkness. The rider felt the tension rise with every step. His breath grew shallow, and sweat gathered on his palms even though the morning was cool. When they reached the edge of the woods, the hunter raised his hand for silence. Through the trees, the rider could see the faint movement of figures. The wagon was parked in a clearing. A horse drank from a small pool. 4 men paced around, talking, pointing at the trees, at the hills, at the ground. Scraps of their conversation floated through the air. Carried by the breeze, rich land here. Enough water to build something real. No one around to stop us. The rider felt the words strike him like blows. He looked at the younger woman, who had understood enough English to close her eyes in worry. The hunter watched them quietly, reading their reactions without needing translation. Then, one of the men turned and kicked at the wagon wheel with frustration. He complained about the tribe, saying he saw smoke the night before. Another said they should approach boldly and claim the land, that tribes did not own everything they walked on. Their voices rose with confidence and ignorance, each sentence revealing their intentions. The rider's stomach tightened. These men wanted to take the land. They were not here by accident. They believed their own desires mattered more than generations of people who already lived here. And they perceived kindness as weakness. The hunter leaned closer and whispered through the younger woman that they needed to hear more, to understand if the men planned to move on or return with more people. The rider nodded, though fear tugged hard at him. Then something happened that made the tension snap taut like a drawn BOWSTRING. One of the men pulled out a rifle. Not to fire it, but to wave it around while boasting. He pointed it at the woods, laughing, threatening to scare off anyone who came near. Another man joked that if the tribe stood in their way, they'd teach them to move. The younger woman's breath hitched. The hunter's face tightened into granite, the rider knew, with painful clarity that words alone might not stop these men. But there was no turning back now. The tribe needed to know everything, and the rider needed to prove himself not by charm or gentle acts, but by facing the darkness head-on. As the men continued arguing, the hunter motioned to move back. But before they could take more than a step, a twig snapped under the rider's boot. The small sound felt louder than thunder. The men froze. Their heads jerked toward the woods. One man lifted his rifle, another grabbed the reins of his horse, a third whispered sharply. Saying he heard something, the younger woman grabbed the rider's arm, her eyes wide with warning. The hunter reached for his bow, not to attack, but to defend if there was no other choice. Footsteps started moving toward them, slow, suspicious, calculated. The rider's pulse pounded in his throat. His breath grew shallow. The forest around them seemed to hold still, as if the trees themselves were watching the moment unfold. They could not run. They could not reveal themselves. They could only wait as the strangers drew closer, each step bringing the knife edge of danger. Closer to their throats, the man with the rifle stepped into the shade of the trees, and the rider realized they were seconds away from being discovered. With no place left to hide and no certainty of what would happen when their paths collided, the moment the armed man stepped into the shade of the trees, everything tightened around the rider. He could hear the faint tremble of the younger woman's breath beside him and feel the hunter's steady presence just ahead. The forest seemed to shrink, drawing every sound into sharper focus. Dry leaves rustled beneath the stranger's boots as he moved in slow, careful steps, scanning the trees for movement. His voice cut through the stillness, low and tense, telling the others he was certain someone was watching them. The rider knew this was the closest he had ever been to danger. But instead of shaking, something inside him steadied. Maybe it was the knowledge that running would only bring trouble to the tribe. Maybe it was the memory of the older woman's trust, fragile yet real. Or maybe it was the idea that courage meant standing still even when fear gnawed at your ribs. Whatever it was, it held him firmly in place. The hunter raised his hand slightly, telling them not to move. His breath remained slow. He stood without fear, as if the forest itself hid him. The rider tried to match that stillness, holding his breath as the stranger's shadow passed close enough for him to hear the click of the rifle. For a long moment, the man stared at the trees, uncertain. Then one of his friends shouted from the clearing, calling him back. They were arguing again, loud enough that the crunch of their boots drew the stranger away. He walked backward at first, still suspicious, then turned and disappeared toward the wagon. The rider let out a breath he didn't know he'd been holding. The younger woman whispered a quiet prayer of thanks, and the hunter placed a hand on the rider's shoulder. It was not praise, but acknowledgement. They had avoided a direct confrontation, and that was the first step toward resolving the conflict without harm. They moved back through the forest carefully, taking a different route so the wagon group wouldn't follow their trail. The trees gradually thinned, and the familiar shape of the camp appeared between gaps in the branches. When they arrived, the tribe gathered around them instantly. The older woman hurried forward, her gaze sweeping over each of them to make sure they were unharmed. The children peeked from behind their mothers, sensing a change in the air. The hunter explained what they heard. The younger woman translated everything with clarity, her voice steady but filled with concern. The tribe listened silently as the truth of the threat settled over them. The older woman nodded slowly, her expression thoughtful rather than frightened. She had seen much in her life, enough to know that fear was not what kept a community strong. Understanding was, when she turned to the rider, her eyes held a different kind of weight. He had walked toward danger with them. He had listened. He had not acted recklessly. The stern woman who doubted him still stood off to the side. Her arms folded, but even she watched him with less suspicion than before. The older woman gathered the tribe for a council. They formed a circle around the fire, men and women sitting side by side. The rider was invited to sit as well, something he did with quiet humility. This was not just a meeting. This was trust extended in a way only a few outsiders ever received. The hunter spoke first. He said the wagon group had come to scout the land for themselves. They believed no one lived here with rightful claim. They came with weapons and intentions that did not honor the land or its people. If left unchecked, they would return with more men. The tribe needed a decision that preserved peace yet protected the children and elders. The older woman turned to the rider. She asked, through the younger woman, how settlers usually responded when confronted peacefully. The rider thought carefully before answering. He said some settlers were willing to talk. Others were only interested in land and power. But if they showed that the tribe was organized, united, and unwilling to be pushed away, there was a chance the men would choose an easier path somewhere else. He added that showing strength did not always mean fighting. Sometimes it meant standing firm with enough people that trouble seekers thought twice, the council murmured, weighing his words. Finally, the older woman made a decision. They would all go together, not with weapons drawn, but as a community. The hunter, several men, many of the women, and the rider would walk to the edge of the forest and speak with the wagon group in daylight. They would show that this land was not empty. It held people, traditions, and children who lived here in peace. The tribe would not threaten or attack unless forced, but they would not hide either. The plan carried risk. But it also carried honor. When the tribe moved, it was with quiet unity. Smoke from the morning fire drifted behind them as they walked through the forest in a long line. The rider walked beside the younger woman, with the hunter leading them. The older woman walked slightly behind, her presence strong despite her age. When they neared the clearing, the men with the wagon turned sharply, surprised by the sight of so many people approaching calmly. Their eyes jumped from face to face, and their hands hovered near their weapons. But they hesitated. The Apache did not come running with anger. They walked with dignity, with elders and children visible. It was clear they were not a small band living in fear. They were a community. The hunter stepped forward first, raising his hand to show he carried no threat. The rider stepped beside him, acting as the bridge between the worlds. He greeted the men in a steady voice, telling them the tribe lived here peacefully and had no reason to harm them unless they brought harm themselves. He explained that the land around them was not empty or free to take. It held families, history, and traditions older than any settlement the men had ever seen. One man scoffed at first, saying land was land and anyone with strength could claim it. But when he looked into the faces of the tribe behind the hunter, something in his stance shifted. The older woman met his eyes directly, her calm presence unsettling in a quiet way. The younger woman spoke in her language, her tone firm and confident. The hunter stayed still, unshaken. The rider added that if the men chose peace and left, they could avoid trouble that would only grow worse for them. If they returned with more people, the tribe would rally with allies across the region. The frontier was wide. There were easier lands for the men to explore without challenging people who already lived here. Silence stretched through the clearing. The men with the wagon exchanged looks. Their bravado cracked under the weight of reality. They had not expected unity or wisdom. They had expected fear. Finally, the man with the rifle lowered it slowly. His shoulders dropped in surrender. He muttered that they had no intention of starting a war. He said they would head north, where the land was flatter and water sources more plentiful. The others nodded reluctantly, some shamefaced, some relieved. As they packed up their things, the rider felt a wave of relief sweep through him. The hunter stood straighter. The younger woman let out a breath. The older woman bowed her head slightly, thanking the land for guiding peace. When the wagon rolled away and the dust settled, the tribe turned back toward their camp. On the walk home, the older woman placed her hand on the rider's arm. She told him he had fulfilled the custom. He had delighted the women of the tribe not by charm, but by standing with them, respecting them, and keeping their people safe. The stern woman even gave him a nod of approval, something she did not offer lightly. The child he had saved smiled at him. From the older woman's side, the rider felt something warm and unexpected bloom inside him. For the first time in a long while, he did not feel like a man running from his past. He felt like someone who belonged somewhere. The tribe invited him to stay, not just as a guest, but as a part of their world. He accepted softly, knowing he had found a place where kindness and courage mattered more than anything else. That night, the camp glowed with laughter and relief. The women smiled at him with pride. The hunter shared food with him as an equal. The younger woman translated less and less because he had begun to understand more than just their words. He understood their hearts, and as the stars brightened across the old American sky, the rider realized that the frontier could take everything from a man, but it could also give him something far more precious. A second chance. A community. A place to belong. The land had tested him, the tribe had waited for his truth, and he had risen to meet both. He watched the firelight reflect in the eyes of the people around him and felt peace drift into his chest like a long-awaited breath. The story of fear had ended, and in its place grew something steady and hopeful, like the soft heartbeat of the earth beneath their feet. It was the beginning of a new chapter, shaped by trust, unity, and the simple strength of standing together on the land they all called home.